He signed the papers on a Tuesday. I remember because it was recycling day and I had just dragged the blue bin to the end of the driveway when his car pulled out of the garage without stopping. He didn't wave. After 41 years, he didn't even slow down. I loved my husband. I want to say that first, because what comes after is complicated, and I don't want anyone to mistake complication for hatred. His name was Bernard. Bernie, to the people who thought they knew him well. To me, near the end, he was just a man I no longer recognized, living in the house we had built together on Lakeshore Road. We met in 1981 at a Christmas party in Guelph. I was 26 and working as a bookkeeper for a small construction firm. He was 30, already starting his first contracting business, full of plans that he described with both hands moving. He was the kind of man who made you believe the thing he was selling simply because he believed it so completely himself. I was not a woman who fell easily. My mother had raised me in Brantford to be careful, to think twice, to read the fine print. But with Bernie, I didn't read the fine print. I just said yes. We married in June of 1983. We had 2 children, a son and a daughter, both born in the late 80s. We lived in the same house in Burlington for 37 years. I raised those children in that house. I kept the books for his business while nursing infants and packing school lunches and driving to hockey and dance and the orthodontist twice a year. I did not work outside the home after our first child was born because Bernie said there was no need and because I believed him. That belief cost me. The construction business grew. Over the decades, it became something substantial. Bernie had a talent for land development and an even greater talent for knowing exactly who to have dinner with. By the time our children were in university, we were comfortable in the way that people say comfortable when they mean something more than that. The house in Burlington was worth a great deal. There was a property in Prince Edward County he had purchased quietly in 2009, a piece of land on the water that he always called an investment, never ours. There were things I did not know existed until a lawyer named Carla Dennison spread a stack of documents across her desk in Hamilton and said, "I need you to understand what has already happened here." But I am getting ahead of myself. The first time I noticed something wrong was not a single moment. It was an accumulation of small wrongnesses that I explained away one by one because I was used to explaining things away. Bernie had always been private about money. He said it was how he was raised, that finances were not a subject for the dinner table. When I asked questions, he answered briefly and changed the subject, and I accepted this because I trusted him and because after 40 years, you develop habits of trust that are very difficult to break even when you should. In 2010, he started working later. He started taking his phone to other rooms. These are the things you notice but catalog as nothing, as stress or age or business complications. He had a partner in the development company, a man named Preston, who I had always found too smooth, too friendly in a way that felt rehearsed. Preston had a new girlfriend that year, a woman 20 years younger than he was, and the two of them began appearing at dinners and events that I was not told about until after. I found out about her in the way most women find out about things they wish they hadn't. He left his email open on the kitchen computer. She had written to him. It was not ambiguous. I did not throw things. I did not scream. I sat down at the kitchen table and I read it twice, and then I closed the laptop and I went upstairs and I sat on the edge of our bed for a very long time. When he came home that evening, I told him what I had found. He did not deny it. What he did instead was something I had not expected. He was calm, arranged, as if this conversation had been rehearsed. He said that he had been unhappy for a long time. He said the marriage had run its course. He said he had already spoken to a lawyer. He had already spoken to a lawyer. He was 74 years old, and he had already spoken to a lawyer. And I was 71, and I was sitting on the edge of our bed, and I had spoken to no one. He moved into the guest room that night. 3 weeks later, I was served with divorce papers at the front door by a process server in a gray jacket who didn't meet my eyes. The document listed our home in Burlington as an asset and noted that a substantial portion of the development company's holdings had been transferred the previous year into a numbered corporation registered in Ontario. It was the first I had heard of that corporation. I called my daughter that evening. She already knew. She said she had known for some time. She said she hoped I would try to be reasonable. That word, reasonable. As if fighting for what was mine was something other than reason. My son called 2 days later. He said almost the same things in a different order. He said his father was not well, that the stress of a contested divorce could affect his health, that he hoped we could settle things quietly. I asked him if he had considered how this might affect my health. He said he knew this was hard. It was hard in a way that I am not sure either of them will ever understand, because they were not the ones who had spent 4 decades doing invisible work. They had not kept the family running while Bernie drove to meetings and shook hands and made things happen. They had not been the constant, quiet infrastructure of a life that looked effortless from the outside because someone was working very hard to make it so. I want to be careful not to be unfair to them. They were not cruel people. They were people who had grown up watching their father build things and watching their mother maintain things. And somewhere in that watching, they had concluded, without ever saying it out loud, that maintenance was worth less than building. Children absorb what they see. I think about that often now. My first lawyer was a pleasant man in Oakville who specialized in family law and who explained the Ontario Family Law Act to me with the patience of someone who has explained it many times before. He was competent. He was not, as I would learn, the right person for what my situation had become. He told me I was entitled to equalization of net family property. He told me the process would take time. He did not tell me that by the time the process played out, the assets might look very different from what they were. A friend of mine, a woman I had known since the children were small, came to see me one afternoon in February. She brought a casserole and a name. She said she had gone through a difficult divorce herself years earlier, and that there was a firm in Hamilton, Mackenzie and Shore, that handled high-asset divorces with particular expertise in cases involving corporate restructuring and financial concealment. She said these were not words she used lightly. I wrote down the name. I called Mackenzie and Shore the following week. The lawyer I was assigned was a woman in her 50s named Vivienne, who wore reading glasses on a chain and spoke with a precision that I found both intimidating and deeply reassuring. She did not offer me sympathy in our first meeting. She asked me questions, specific, methodical, exhausting questions. When had the numbered corporation been formed? What was the date on the transfer documents? Had I signed anything in the last 3 years without fully understanding its purpose? Had I ever been asked to sign as a director or officer of any entity I didn't recognize? I answered as best I could. Some things I didn't know. She told me what we would need to find out. What Vivienne uncovered over the following months was not surprising to her. It was devastating to me. The numbered corporation, 2847 193 Ontario Inc., had been registered in March of 2021. The Prince Edward County property had been transferred to that corporation in September of the same year. This was nearly 12 months before Bernie served me with divorce papers. A piece of land that had appreciated significantly since its purchase had been quietly moved out of our joint marital estate and into a structure I had no knowledge of and no share in. Vivienne explained it to me in plain language. Under Ontario's Family Law Act, property transferred before the date of separation could, under certain circumstances, be argued to fall outside the equalization calculation if the receiving party could establish the transfer had been made for legitimate business reasons. Bernie's lawyers were going to argue exactly that. They were going to say it was a business restructuring, not an attempt to shield assets. She asked me one question that I remember very clearly. She asked whether I had any documentation, any email, any conversation that might establish when Bernie had actually decided to end the marriage, regardless of when he formally told me. I went home and I looked. I am a woman who keeps things. This is something Bernie always found mildly amusing and mildly irritating. I've kept birthday cards and utility bills and Christmas card lists going back 20 years. I kept a paper calendar on the refrigerator, the kind with the spiral binding, and I wrote things down on it because I liked paper. In January of 2021, Bernie had called a meeting with his accountant and his lawyer on the same day. I had written it on the calendar in blue pen because he had asked me to hold that afternoon clear. He'd said it was about restructuring the company's liability profile. January 2021, 8 months before the Prince Edward County transfer, 26 months before he handed me divorce papers. Vivienne looked at the calendar page and she looked at the other documents and she looked at me and she said, "This is useful." I won't pretend the next year and a half was anything other than what it was. It was grueling and expensive and lonely in a way that is difficult to describe to anyone who hasn't lived it. My children remained politely distant. They came to visit occasionally and we spoke carefully around everything that mattered. My son-in-law, who had always been a quiet man, said nothing at all. My daughter's face, when she sat across from me at the kitchen table, had an expression I recognized as the one she used when she was waiting for something uncomfortable to be over. What kept me going was partly stubbornness and partly something simpler. I had contributed to everything we had, not in equal measure perhaps, not in the way that could be itemized on a spreadsheet, but in the essential way that makes a life function. I had been the reason the house ran, the reason the children were whole, the reason Bernie could focus entirely on his work for 4 decades without ever having to think about what he was coming home to. That contribution was real. It had value. And I was not willing to walk away from 41 years and 3 months as if none of it had happened. The legal proceedings were filed in the fall. Vivienne's team brought a motion arguing that the transfer of the Prince Edward County property had been made in anticipation of divorce and should therefore be included in the equalization calculation. Bernie's lawyers filed the predictable response. The documentation I had provided, the calendar, the timeline, the series of financial movements Vivienne's team had traced through the company accounts became central to the argument. Bernie's health declined during this period. I knew this through my daughter, who told me in the careful, neutral way she had adopted for all conversations about her father. He had a cardiac issue in the spring. He was managing it, she said, but it was serious. I asked if he needed anything. She seemed surprised by the question. I sent him a card. I don't know if he read it. In July of that year, on a Thursday afternoon, Vivienne called me at home. She said she had something to tell me, and her voice had a different quality than it usually did. She said Bernie had been admitted to the hospital 4 days earlier and had suffered a significant cardiac event. She said he was alive, but that his capacity to manage his own affairs was, according to his doctors, substantially impaired. She said his lawyers had been in contact. She said they wanted to settle. The negotiations took 6 weeks. There were things I agreed to and things I did not. The Prince Edward County property was included in the equalization. The numbered corporation was unwound and its assets accounted for. The Burlington house had already been listed at my insistence. I did not want to stay in it. Too many rooms, too many years, too many mornings. I had stood in the kitchen making coffee for a man who had already decided to leave me. The equalization I received was not everything. It was not justice in the clean, simple sense of the word, but it was fair in the technical legal meaning, and after a year and a half of fighting, fair felt like something. I moved to a condominium in Dundas in the autumn. My friend helped me pack. She brought wine and we sat on the floor surrounded by boxes, and she did not offer optimistic speeches about new beginnings. She just sat with me, which was what I needed. Bernie's condition did not improve. He was discharged to a long-term care facility outside of Hamilton the following spring. My daughter told me this in a text message. I read it and I sat with it for a moment, and I didn't know exactly what I felt. Not triumph, not grief, exactly. Something more like the specific exhaustion that comes at the end of something that has cost you a great deal. My children eventually came around, in the way that children do when the immediate crisis has passed and they have had time to see things more clearly. My daughter called me one evening and she cried, and she said she was sorry, and I told her the truth, which was that I understood why she had done what she had done, and that understanding it did not mean it hadn't hurt. She said she knew. We have been rebuilding since then, slowly. My son is slower. He is more like his father in this way, which is to say he finds apology difficult and approaches it sideways. But he comes for Sunday dinner now, and last month he fixed the broken latch on my balcony door without being asked, and I think that was his version of sorry. I am 73 years old. I live in a two-bedroom condominium with a view of the Dundas Valley, and in the mornings I make coffee and I drink it by the window before the day starts. And there is no one asking me to hold an afternoon clear, or schedule a meeting, or stay quiet about the things I don't understand. My friend drives over on Wednesdays. We have been doing this since autumn. We sit in my kitchen and we talk about our children and the news and what we are reading, and sometimes we talk about the years that have passed and what they cost us. And sometimes we don't talk about any of that and we just drink our coffee and look out the window at whatever the valley is doing that day. I planted a rose bush on the small patch of green outside my unit last spring. The building manager said it was fine as long as I maintained it. It bloomed in June, small and persistent, the same yellow I had always wanted in the garden on Lakeshore Road and never gotten around to planting. I thought about Bernie when it bloomed, not with bitterness, not with love exactly, but with the complicated feeling you have for something that shaped your entire life and is now finished. I got what was mine, and I am still here, which is not nothing. There is something I have thought about often since moving to Dundas, something I couldn't have articulated while I was still in the middle of it all. When Bernie sat across from me that evening, calm, prepared, already lawyered up, he had calculated everything except one thing. He had not calculated that I would stop explaining things away. I spent 41 years being reasonable, being accommodating, filing things under stress or his way of doing things are not worth the argument. That habit kept the household running. It also kept me from seeing clearly for a very long time. I don't say this with bitterness toward myself. I think most women of my generation learned to do exactly what I did, and most of us had good reasons. But there is a moment, and I remember mine precisely, sitting at the kitchen table after closing the laptop, when you decide that understanding a situation is no longer enough. You have to do something with what you understand. That decision, I think, is where everything turned. Bernie was a man who knew how to move quickly and quietly. The numbered corporation, the transferred property, the children already briefed, he had prepared the ground carefully. What he had not prepared for was someone who kept paper calendars. Someone who wrote things down in blue pen because she liked the way it felt. That single page, January 2021, with his accountant and his lawyer's names in my handwriting, became the thread that Vivian pulled until the whole arrangement came apart. I am not a lawyer. I am not a financial strategist. What I am is a woman who paid attention for 4 decades, who kept records without knowing they would matter, who had the good sense to call Mackenzie and Shore when my first instinct was simply to accept what I had been told. That is what I mean when I think about the difference between being intelligent in the narrow sense and being wise in the practical one. Intelligence without the willingness to use it is just potential sitting in a drawer. What mattered was that I used what I had when it finally became necessary. My children came back to me eventually, not all at once and not without cost, but they came back. And when my daughter sat across from me crying, I thought about cause and consequence, not in any mystical sense, but in the plain human sense. The choices people make ripple outward. Her father's choices rippled toward her too, not just toward me. She had aligned herself with someone who had been carefully deceptive, and she had done it without full information. and living with that afterward was its own kind of reckoning. What I hope, if any of this is useful to anyone, is this: the integrity you keep in quiet moments, the records you maintain, the questions you ask even when the answer is uncomfortable, the decision to stand up even when it would be easier to settle. Those things compound over time in the same way that dishonesty does. Bernie's deception compounded until it collapsed under its own weight. My persistence, which felt for a long time like stubbornness and not much more, compounded into something I could actually stand on. The rose bush is doing well this summer. Small yellow blooms, exactly as I wanted. It took root faster than I expected. So did I.